Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to the post 112, Hubris Syndrome. This post comes via request from my great mate Kevin. I've got some wonderful Kevins in my life, and this particular Kevin is an outstanding scholar and professional in project management. And Kevin asked me if I would talk about Hubris Syndrome. And I hadn't heard of it, to be frank, so I've gone out into the universe and done the research, and I am stunned and thrilled to share this conversation with you today. As always, when you give me these requests, I learn so much. I'm thrilled to deliver that with you. And as you can hear, I apologise in advance. I'm managing a cold, so let's hope we don't overshare the messiness, but I'll do the best I can this week, and apologies if some random sort of Labrador barks emerge during this gig. So let's do it. Today has three parts. Firstly, we're going to talk about what is hubris syndrome. The second part explores why it has emerged at this point in our history. And the final one is a how-to guide. So once we've got this information about hubris syndrome, right, well, what do we do with it and how do we deploy it in our daily working lives? Okay, let's go for it. And let's start with our definitional work. What is hubris syndrome? As with many areas that we discuss and talk about in this post and beyond in life, in knowledge, we start with the ancient Greeks. Now, they labelled a human being who was arrogant, prideful, haughty after the goddess Hubris. Now, she was basically the Paris Hilton of the goddesses. She was insolent, she lacked control, and her manners were somewhat challenging. So the Greek word hubris captures excess, pride, and arrogance. But when I was doing the etymological work on hubris, there's another variable we need to remember. It carries the meaning of inviting disaster. Now, I didn't know that, inviting disaster. Hold on to that, that will become important. What is significant is that people are not born with these attributes. What happens is a person in a particular context transgresses social norms and limitations. So the rights of other humans are demeaned, are ignored, because the person showing hubris believes that they are superior from the rest of us. So from this early etymology, the Greeks argued that hubris attacks rulers, that is politicians, that is educators, but also merchants. So from this origin in the ancient Greeks, and with the ancient Greeks, let's update this story to 2008. And a remarkable man, David Owen, member of the House of Lords, former Chancellor, also British neurologist. And he published an article and a series of publications titled around hubris syndrome. Now, we are living in this weird century, and my goodness me, hasn't it been weird so far? And we've been living in this weird century accompanied by a series of syndromes. Basically, if something weird happens, a syndrome is named after it. So Owen's hubris syndrome is part of a trend, and he used the phrase in a really interesting way to describe those humans who believe that they are destined for greatness. They do not listen to others, they don't take any criticism or advice. So this is an acquired psychiatric disorder, and it affects those in positions of power. They lose empathy, they're disconnected from reality, and they're people of both pride and arrogance. Now, in this sort of taxonomy that's been developed through this century, hubris syndrome has 14 tendencies or characteristics, and this list was constructed by David Owen, but with the assistance of Jonathan Davidson. Now, as Jen Delegato confirms, there is an overlap here with other syndromes, other challenges, particularly you'll see narcissistic personality disorder, but also some antisocial behaviours and disorders as well. So let's get into it. 14 characteristics, boom, let's do it. 1, narcissistic tendency, obviously. So the world becomes a stage to exercise personal glory. 2, exaggerated self-confidence. And yet, this is dangerous. The person feels that they can do anything and they deserve favoured treatment. 3, excessive confidence in their own judgment and contempt for the opinions, ideas, and criticisms of others. So they don't dialogue with others at all. They have no value for the opinions or feedback of others, and they surround themselves, Peter Principle 101, they surround themselves with people who do not contradict them. So we're at 4, carrying out actions that glorify themselves. So their image is the focus and they sell that image at every possible opportunity. 5, exaggerated concern with the image that they project. So this results in really weird behaviour, okay? They think they're being special or unique, but the behaviour moves from special and unique to weird really damn quickly. 6, much to my amusement, they speak in a godlike way. So small achievements are blown up into sort of mythic status as proof of their greatness. 7, excessive identification with country, state, or the organisation. So they don't work for Apple, they are Apple. They're not President of the United States, they are the United States. 8, tendency to restlessness, impulsiveness, and recklessness. We see frequent bouts of anger and profound defensiveness whenever that ego is threatened. 9, love this one, talking about themselves in the third person. Now, one of the Australian Prime Ministers was a guy called John Howard, and he had a tendency to do this all the time. I thought at the time, this is bloody weird. So instead of going, hi, I'm Tara, I think this, me, I, cool, we, us, instead of using those sorts of words, the person refers to themselves in the third person all the time. So John Howard thinks this. John Howard is going for a walk. John Howard is going for a jog. So referring to themselves in the third person. 10, absolute conviction that they are right. So they ignore details, ignore the costs, and in fact alternatives never cross their mind. 11, wow, believing that they are not accountable to or for other humans and their safety. They ignore criticisms, they ignore worries, and believe that they are only accountable to God. Okay. 12, they're certain that they're right, but this is the other interesting bit, certain that they're right, but they know that only other elites will understand them. So they see themselves as a member of the elite, a special group, and ordinary people are literally below them and cannot understand them. 13, loss of contact with reality. So this is a lovely Badrillian moment, really. They are increasingly isolated from their environment because, I love this, they are living in a world that they've built in their minds. They're surrounded by and protected by people who do not contradict them, and so that means they end up completely disconnected from reality. 14, hubristic incompetence through overestimating their abilities. Wow. So because they're not getting feedback from others, they're not getting commentary and criticism from others, they lack attention to detail, they act impulsively, and they make mistakes. Okay, so there's your 14. Now, Owen and Davidson argued that to be diagnosed with hubris syndrome, you had to show 3 of the 14. Now, I think we all know people that have all of those characteristics. Pardon my nose for one moment. Not 3 of the 14. I think we know people in our lives today that have all 14 of those tendencies. Now, this syndrome was modelled and it was constructed to understand politicians. It was particularly geared as a taxonomy to understand politicians. But of course, it's got a much wider definition now. It is used to understand people holding power, whatever area of human endeavour in which they may be placed. So the other argument here that we need to remember is that the longer a person holds power, the more likely they are to develop this syndrome. Now, this syndrome is reversible because the moment the person loses power, they have this tough return to reality because all the protections are gone. Now, in Greek mythology, this ending was a ripper, and I'm obsessed by this. So, in Greek mythology, there was a fantastic goddess of balance, of order, and of measure. And her name was Nemesis. Can I say, I'm hoping to be able to get a dog at some point if we ever get stable accommodation. And I would like to call my dog Nemesis. So you go to the dog park, Nemesis, come here. How fantastic is that? Anyway, so the goddess was Nemesis. And Nemesis was charged with punishing the person with hubris. And that person would be returned back, brought back to the rules and the limitations of reality and life and normality. And that bringing back has been described as, quote, a reality shock. So without a nemesis in our lives wandering about, and what a tragedy we don't have a nemesis sort of wandering around go, you back, we have to understand the consequences of hubris syndrome in our lives for leadership. And so our second stop today is contextual. Why are we doing all of this work now? Now, this syndrome has a precise history and a context. When David Owen published his paper titled Hubris Syndrome in 2008 in the journal Clinical Medicine, he made it clear that it is only developed by those people in power, and it has an increasing likelihood of developing the longer that human is in power. Quite a powerful argument, that one. So his syndrome was based on case studies of 4 particular humans. So let's do them. David Lloyd George, Margaret Thatcher, George W. Bush, and surprise, surprise not, Tony Blair. Now, you'll note the date of this first article was 2008. So the planet was still dealing with the consequences of September 11, wars in Afghanistan, wars in Iraq, weapons of mass destruction. Anyone? Yeah, nah. That's the period. So this article was then followed in 2009 with another article, this time in the journal Brain, fascinating journal, written by David Owen and again Jonathan Davidson. And this article broadened out much more beyond the case studies to look at the impact of this syndrome on the configuration of leadership. So they recognise that a successful leader must have confidence, have vision, the capacity to persuade, but that these positive, important tendencies can be inverted and ruptured and twisted so that the human very quickly refuses to take advice, refuses to listen, and the impulsiveness becomes incompetence, creating reckless behaviour, reckless decisions that create catastrophes. Now, what I've loved doing in my work for Kevin on this topic is I've then tracked the citations since 2008 and 2009 to see how this research has been used for the nearly 20 years since it was published. And the disciplinary movement, without a doubt, is moving straight from psychology into leadership studies. Now, Jean-Paul Selton argued in 2023 that hubris syndrome is now, he's pretty comfortable that it be included in the psychological classification systems. He argued that there's now enough research into leadership to show that hubris syndrome is a personality disorder that emerges way outside of late adolescence or early adulthood. Selton describes it as a, quote, non-organic personality change, end of quote. And it only emerges after achieving power and success. So this means that this particular tendency syndrome is contextually dependent. It increases in the likelihood of excessiveness and development the longer the person is in leadership. So this resulting dissociality has some proxies. Now, I've loved doing this research. A lot of recent studies using machine learning algorithms has confirmed a difference between hubristic and non-hubristic speech patterns that we'll talk about in a second. So the research through the 2010s and the 2020s is now using hubris syndrome as a diagnostic tool to understand problematic leadership. In fact, the leadership literature, which is a really, really big literature, refers to destructive leadership. That's now a category pretty well now, destructive leadership, when they locate hubris syndrome. So we see someone that's overly ambitious and particularly reckless in decision making. So studies of the syndrome have obviously moved from the political realm into universities, but also into corporations. Now, as we all know, and remember I've done a master's degree in leadership theory, leadership studies, if we want to call it an interdisciplinary post-disciplinary field, which it probably is, leadership studies is filled with models. So you've got charismatic leadership, transactional leadership, transformational leadership, authentic leadership, servant leadership. Models, whenever you're in an interview, what's your model of leadership, right? It's not really a model, it's more of a theory, but let's keep going. So what's very interesting to me is increasingly in leadership studies, there is a recognition finally that there are troubled and troubling people in leadership. Now, the reason, that seems very obvious, but the reason that leadership studies is only just providing the taxonomy to understand these destructive and problematic leaderships is that leadership studies and the leadership industry that it fuels makes a lot of money. And through consultancies, through coaching, you go into an organisation, you run leadership training, leadership seminars, everybody wants to be a leader, really, but anyway, so there's a lot of money to be made from leadership training. So the last thing you want to do is acknowledge, the longer somebody is in leadership, the more likely these really toxic tendencies are to emerge. So the challenge we've got, and it's a big problem for leadership studies now, I would argue, is that the field has to find strategies to acknowledge and manage the systemic and systematic damage that some modes of leadership are doing to the planet. Now, of course, acknowledging those types of challenges, that's not the way to get consultancy money. But we are now living in an age of hubris leadership. It's so pervasive on the planet now that it's becoming our new normal. Self-absorbed, disconnected narcissists. They don't take advice. And because they don't take advice and listen, it results in catastrophic errors for the planet. So this hubris syndrome, quite rightly, now sort of has to be discussed, and the citation rates of the literature have exploded since 2016 for obvious reasons. So, to be frank, these are really dangerous people. They're lacking empathy, lacking any sort of respect or regard for other humans. We've got attention-seeking behaviours, and even perhaps most worryingly, a sense of entitlement, the notion that they were born to rule. Now, this is dangerous in politics, but I would argue it's dangerous in all areas of public service. But It is particularly catastrophic, I would argue, in educational institutions, and therefore my final section of the post is for all of us. We've got the knowledge now. What do we do about it? So how do we deploy this information in our daily working lives? Let's go for it. How do we use hubris syndrome? And Kevin, I really thank you for this suggestion. I feel quite changed by this suggestion, because we need to just hold on to some tenets of truth. So hubris syndrome is contextually dependent. It's gained only in positions of power, and it increases the longer the human is in power. Right. So the greater problem, though, is this syndrome is very, very difficult to study, because the people who have it, needless to say, don't want to be studied. So it's very difficult. You can't really do qual quant on this. It's got to be theoretical and unobtrusive research methodologies, right? But through Owen's investigation of these characteristics, we as workers, we as citizens, can recognize these tendencies, understand what's happening, and reorganize ourselves, summon our own nemesis, and configure our borders, our barriers, and recognize what's going on nice and quick. Now, while, as Jared Russell has argued, psychiatrists and the rest of us are drawn to sort of these classification systems like their horoscopes, he also revealed the profound danger of these powerful people being in these positions, deeply impaired, and yet making decisions. Think about Anthony Eden and the Suez Crisis. Think about JFK and the Bay of Pigs. Their physical health problems impacted on their decision making with consequences for the world. Owen therefore wants healthcare professionals and citizens to understand what he describes as, quote, the causal link between holding power and aberrant behaviour that has a whiff of mental instability about it, end of quote, with humility missing. To quote the legendary Bertrand Russell, these leaders are lost in, quote, the intoxication of power, end of quote. Now, as we know from Gramsci, we all have to consent to our own oppression. We consent to our subordinate status. And the reason why we do something as irrational as that is because we receive concessions for that subordination. Let me explain. So when we're working, we are in a subordinate situation. We have to do as we're told. But we've accepted the concession of payment. We receive a wage for that subordinate status, right? So, right, we do what we're told, but we're paid. So that's the concession for the subordinate status. Now, this is one of the reasons I've invested a lot of my recent research in followership rather than leadership. I would argue, to be frank, followership is a lot more important than leadership. There are always more followers than there are leaders, and it's much more important to build a community of listening and learning and thinking. Followership is a skill set of response abilities, the capacity to make a response, often quickly. Therefore, to make all of this work, we need a trusted and trusting relationship between leaders and followers. And when that trusting relationship exists, errors and mistakes reduce. Now, hubris syndrome blocks the capacity for the development of meaningful followership. Therefore, hubris syndrome is valuable for all of us to understand, because it's actually a tool to understand what's occurring in our working environments, but also the world. If we see any of those 14 characteristics of hubris syndrome, we know immediately we have to solidify and maintain our own personal and professional boundaries. We must patrol them, we must monitor them. And we also have to know those leaders are going to make mistakes, and a lot of them. They will not acknowledge those mistakes, and they will throw followers, they'll throw their workers under the bus to mask their own errors. So if we carry this knowledge into our working lives, then we can actively interpret in real time the events as they are occurring. So this means we can assess risks and we can enact risk mitigation, such as put any disagreements in writing. So don't do this, don't do this. If issues are occurring, write it down in an email. It's dated and timed. And this has helped me a lot as I've gotten possibly old. Try to continue to focus back on problems or issues rather than people and personalities. People and personalities don't matter at all. Don't matter at all. Focus on the issue, the goal, the problem. And the key is to continue to use evidence rather than emotion or a thought bubble. Just because you feel something does not mean it's true. Okay, so it's going to be very interesting to watch what happens to leadership training programs in the next little bit and see how they're managing this very big now literature on hubris syndrome. Because what it's showing, and I've read it, what it's showing is profound. It's showing the weakness of leadership, the arrogance of leadership, and also, I'll use that word again, the brittleness of leadership. For those of us as followers, we therefore must really respect the leaders who make different decisions, who find another way of organising power relationships, enabling diversity, enabling decision making, and focusing on evidence rather than an ego. So teams that are run by an individual with hubris syndrome have particular characteristics. And again, haven't we all seen this? A lack of trust, weak relationships, poor decision making, and ineffective teamwork. If any of us can have the privilege, and it is a privilege, of gaining a position of leadership, I think there's a lot of lessons for us all to really learn from this research. And I think the key first lesson is this, that self-perceptions are rarely accurate. Self-perceptions distort decision-making. They create errors, and in the case of political leaders, wars, death, poverty, injustice. No leader is infallible, and when leaders fail to recognise their failures, the result is catastrophe. So the strategies to stop hubris syndrome are clear. Ask for feedback and regularly. Find out the areas you can improve. Use professional development every week of your life if you can. Learn something. Get beyond yourself, learn something. So part of the problem with hubris syndrome is a lack of self-awareness. So the great question is, if you're not self-aware, how do you develop self-awareness? And the answer is feedback, and the answer is professional development. What you're trying to do is find strategies beyond opinion to improve your skill set. And the other strategy is to be a follower, and regularly. The best way to stop being an aloof leader is to get your hands dirty. Get out of the C-suite. Get out of your office. And know. And luckily my wonderful father, Kevin, the other Kevin in my life, Kevin taught me this from a very, very young age. And it's, I think, the great lesson of all our lives, really, that no one is better than anybody else. And you know what? No task is more important than any other. So regularly step out of the leadership role, out of the leadership suite, and do a task at a different level. Understand the workflow. Understand the people who enable that workflow. And that's why I would argue the most powerful model of leadership that we currently have is servant leadership, formed right at the start of the 1970s. And it's a small literature, but why it's such an important literature is during COVID-19, during the pandemic, where all the leadership models failed, appalling leadership, really bad decision making. I understand black swan event, yep, but really, really serious errors were made. But the one model of leadership that succeeded was servant leadership, because the servant leadership remained engaged with everybody and focused primarily on the public good. So let's hope we start to learn these lessons here, and we as citizens can carry forward these tendencies, these characteristics of hubris syndrome. We can understand it, assemble strategies for personal survival, but also have awareness when we see it in a leader to stop that leadership at the first possible opportunity. Good on you, Kevin. Thank you for managing my voice team. I wish you love, light and peace. Tia.